So what are the values that have inspired Oğuz, Erol, and thousands of other Turks to sacrifice their time, talents, funds, and career to a communitarian project they call the Hizmet, or service? Now, this community is inspired by the preaching and writing of the Turkish scholar Fethullah Gulen. It's Gulen's particular understanding of the teaching of the Quran and Hadith, and his appropriation of the way this message has been understood and lived and commented upon by Muslims down through the centuries, that provide the intellectual content of the movement and the ideals pursued by the community. In this paper, I want to focus on another central notion that motivates and characterizes the activities of the Gulen Jamaat. This is the important concept of ibadah, which is broadly translated as worship, and the related concepts of ubudiyya, servanthood, and ubuda, which we might translate as devotion. Fethullah Gulen has applied this traditional language to the practice of Islam in modern situations. Gulen expands upon this traditional view of ibadah to define it very broadly as, and here I quote him, fulfilling God's commands in one's daily life and fulfilling the obligations of being God's servant. When Oğuz teaches physics in Kyrgyzstan, he is performing ibadah. He is worshiping God. When Erol donates funds so that schools, dialogue centers, well-digging projects, and publishing houses can be founded and maintained, he is doing ibadah. His donations are a form of divine worship. The teachers and students are worshiping God when they undertake a scientific study of the universe and its elements. Gulen's comprehensive understanding of worship has resulted almost in a kind of sacralization of education, and helps to account for the emphasis the movement has given to opening and operating schools. Now, Gulen reaches back to the Sufi tradition to note a still deeper stage of worshipful involvement, that of devotion, or ubuda. Now, Gulen reaches back to the Sufi tradition to note a still deeper stage of worshipful involvement, that of devotion, or ubuda. Like the Sufis, going back to Al-Ghazali, Gulen views worship as a way to obtain experiential knowledge of the truths of faith that otherwise would remain only theoretical postulates. Now, Gulen characteristically orients even the stage of ubuda, devotion, toward those members of the Jamaat engaged in what he sees to be the mission of Islam in the world, that is, serving God by serving others. He says, and I quote him, "This vital mission can only be realized by the devout and the godly, who never think of themselves except insofar as they see their own salvation through the salvation of others." The stage of devotion is, in the view of Gulen, not so much a spiritual achievement of the select few who have devoted their lives to the mystical path, but is rather an attitude that can be achieved by any pious Muslim who strives to overcome their selfish passions to serve God and others. This ideal of being one of the devout is one that Gulen has held up to countless young Muslims and has inspired many of them, like Oğuz, with whom I began this paper, to devote their lives to the service, the Hizmet. In speaking of servanthood, Gulen notes that Rumi's greatest boast about himself is not that he was a great saint or a person of great spiritual depth, but simply that he was God's servant. Gulen cites as a model of Islamic humility and joyful service the words of Mevlana, with their famous triple repetition for emphasis. And so now I quote from Mevlana, as Gulen has done in his writings. I have become a servant. Become a servant. Become a servant. I have bowed and doubled myself up with serving you. Servants or slaves rejoice when they are emancipated, whereas I rejoice when I become your servant. Mr. Gulen, he defines worship not in a narrow sense of ritual activity, but it's everything we do as servants of God. So it could be teaching physics in Kyrgyzstan. That's when somebody does that, they're worshiping God, if that's their intention. It could be contributing, giving money so that schools could be built or a dialogue center could be built. It could be meeting people at the airport. It could be preparing lunch for visitors. Anything that we do, if we do it with an attitude of servanthood, that is, what we want to do it to please God, who is our master. That's the idea of worship.
If I were to sum up my presentation in one quote from Fathullah Gulen, it would be this. He said, forgiving consists of a return to our essence, and finding ourselves again. This quote is very much in line with what therapists, clinicians, educators, and researchers have found about the benefits of forgiveness. There was an interview with Naval Savandi. I think it was published in 1997. And she asked Fathullah Gulen this question: you've suffered a lot in your life. How did you overcome events that could have smothered your enthusiasm and smashed you? It would have smashed you. His response, which is very pithy, very brief, but to me, studying the process of forgiveness, his response is the process of forgiveness that took a team in Madison 3 years to come up with. He said, once I was followed for 6 years as if I were a traitor. It bothered me, but I forgot it. I didn't feel hostility toward anyone. Even then, I approached the matter logically, not emotionally. I've forgiven the people who did this. If one day I see the faith of the people secured and a peaceful atmosphere surrounding the world, then everything will have been worthwhile. To me, the first part when he said, it bothered me as a human being when something unfair, deep, interpersonal happens, it touches our emotions. Okay? It bothers us. It makes us angry. We may become resentful. Okay? For some, it could reach to rage. So a host of negative emotions will be triggered. So it bothered him. But then he said, I forgot it. I would have dismissed this as you're just using repression. But he said, I do not feel any hostility toward anyone. Gulen invokes and implores people to forgive because we're instructed to do it religiously. And if we really claim that we love Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he forgave, then we should follow his example. And I believe Fathullah Gulen is a very good example of the example of Prophet Muhammad, because he himself has forgiven those who have wished him ill. So he offers a recipe of how to forgive, the language of forgiveness, tolerance. He said that in conferences we need to talk about it. In the media we need to talk about it. In music, the lyrics should be, reflect tolerance. And wherever we are, it needs to be pervasive. It needs to be everywhere. The movement is so versatile that you can find connections all over the place. It's not narrow. It's very, very broad.
In Sufi parlance, love for the master is essential. That is because the master is seen as a representative of the esoteric function of the Prophet. Therefore, the Sufi's love for the master indirectly is a love for the Prophet. And of course, the love for the Prophet is an expression of the love for God. These Muslim Sufis constitute a legacy of love for the Prophet in the Islamic tradition of Sufism. Gulen's love for the Prophet stems from this rich legacy, as well as from the Quran and from the sayings of the Prophet. Indicating his annihilation in the Prophet, Gulen asks for a new rising. This rising, this is very similar to the Sufi's legacy, indicated in the saying of the Prophet. Yes, the Sufi, as the Prophet says, has to die before he dies, so that he can spiritually be resurrected.
I would say that in my reading of the vision that Gulen has given to his community, you remember these two ideas of purity of intention. Whatever you do, no matter how small, if it's done for God, has a value that is infinite. And secondly, worship. Whatever you do that is done in service to God and service to others for God, those are the two key ideas as far as I can see in the community. Mr. Gulen is talking about is freedom from the obstacles that prevent us from accepting God's grace. God wants to turn us all into people who would be lovingly and enthusiastically serving God and wanting to do God's will. But we all set up obstacles to this. Okay, but don't touch this aspect of my life, or don't do that. And so what the idea of worship can do is to free us from these obstacles that prevent us from accepting the grace of God that's being offered to us constantly. This is just as real for Christians as it is for Muslims.